of parents pay a stranger $1,000 to make their own daughter homeless on the same day she loses her job. My name is Maya Sinclair. I'm 28 years old. And on the worst Tuesday of my professional life, I walked out of a conference room without a job. 40 minutes later, my landlord called and told me, "I need you out by Friday." I thought he was reacting to rumors about the layoffs until his voice dropped. "Your parents offered me $1,000 to terminate your lease immediately." I called my mother first. She laughed. "You have to fall before you can change." My father grabbed the phone and added, "Sleeping outside will teach you." They didn't ask if I had savings. They didn't ask if I had somewhere safe to go. They had already decided that humiliation was the lesson, and my home was the classroom. I hung up before either of them could hear my breathing change. Then my landlord sent me a screenshot of the payment confirmation. That was their mistake. The money hadn't come from a personal account. It came from an account they had no legal right to use for a private family punishment. I stared at the company name on that transfer, opened my contacts, and called the one person my parents had spent years keeping away from every important family decision. I explained what happened in under 30 seconds. Her answer was calm. "Forward me everything. Do not warn them." 1 minute later, my mother called 6 times. 3 minutes later, my father finally got through and shouted, "What did you do?" I looked at the eviction message still glowing on my screen and said, "The same thing you taught me to do." I protected myself. They still had no idea how much that single phone call was about to cost them. Before I tell you who answered and why my parents panicked so quickly, tell me, what time is it where you are right now? Where are you watching from? And what's the weather like there? Does it match your mood today? I'm always curious how far a story like this one can travel. My landlord's name was Frank Doyle. I had rented from him for 4 years, always paid on time, and still had 7 months left on my lease. When I demanded a written reason for forcing me out, he refused to give me one. I stayed quiet on the phone until the silence itself made him nervous. Finally, he admitted my parents had called him before I'd even cleared out my desk. They told him losing my job wasn't enough of a consequence. They wanted me frightened, desperate, and ready to move back home under their rules. They offered him $1,000 and promised to cover any trouble if I resisted leaving. Frank insisted he hadn't deposited the money yet. It was an electronic transfer, he said, and he could still send it back. I told him to send proof first. He refused, until I reminded him that he had just threatened to remove a tenant with a fully valid lease because 2 outsiders had paid him to do it. A screenshot arrived 30 seconds later. The transfer description read, "Consulting retainer." The sender was Hale Family Property Group. My parents, Robert and Karen Sinclair, managed that company. It owned rental homes throughout the county and advertised itself as an ethical, family-centered business. My father gave talks on personal responsibility. My mother published newsletters about stable communities. And yet they had used company money to purchase control over my private home, then disguised the payment as consulting work. What they seemed to forget was that the company didn't belong entirely to them. It had started with my grandmother, Rose Hale, and after her death, ownership passed into a family trust. My parents controlled the daily operations, but my Aunt Vivian Hale held the largest voting share and served as trustee. She lived far away and rarely came to family gatherings. My parents always called her cold, suspicious, and obsessed with paperwork. Their favorite warning growing up was, never involve Vivian in family business. Years earlier, I'd worked one summer in the company office. I watched Vivian question missing receipts while my father joked, off to the side, that she worried too much. After one especially tense meeting, she pulled me aside and gave me her direct number. "You notice what people try not to see," she told me. "Call me if the numbers ever stop matching the story." I hadn't used that number in years. I was about to. Before dialing Vivian, I called my older sister, Natalie. I wanted to believe she knew nothing about any of this. She answered brightly. "I heard you're finally getting the reset you need." The words sounded rehearsed. When I asked about the payment, she went quiet, then said, "It's company money. It's not like they emptied your bank account." That sentence told me she already knew everything. 2 years earlier, I had helped pay for Natalie's certification fees when she was between jobs. When I reminded her of that now, she laughed. That was different. I had a plan. I asked whether she had suggested contacting Frank in the first place. She accused me of being dramatic and said a little fear might make me more ambitious. I ended the call and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the screenshot. This wasn't the first time my parents had called cruelty tough love. At 13, after one bad test grade, my father removed my bedroom door entirely because apparently privacy was a privilege I hadn't earned. When I changed my college major, my mother called relatives and described me as unstable. When Natalie needed help, it was family support. When I needed help, it was weakness. But this time, they had left a trail. The false payment label mattered. The company account mattered. The valid lease mattered. They expected me to panic, beg, and come running home. Instead, I called Sam, my closest friend. His first reaction was imperfect. Maybe they think they're helping, he said, then immediately stopped himself. No. Paying your landlord crosses every line there is. He told me to save the screenshot in several places, download a copy of my lease, and write down every detail while it was still fresh in my memory. Then he asked one question. Who can freeze this before they rewrite the whole story? I looked down at Vivian's number. For years, my parents had controlled every conflict in our family by keeping it contained inside the family, where they alone got to decide what was true. I pressed call and waited. Vivian answered on the second ring. Maya, she said. This is unexpected. I told her I'd lost my job, but I didn't pause for sympathy. I described Frank's demand, my parents' offer, and the transfer from Hale Family Property Group, forwarding the screenshot as I spoke. She went silent long enough for me to hear my own pulse in my ears. Do you have the lease and his messages? She asked. Yes. Did the board approve a consulting contract with this landlord? No. He isn't a consultant. Forward me everything. Do not warn your parents. Do not threaten the landlord. I'm suspending access to the discretionary account and sending a preservation notice. I asked how she could move that fast. I'm the trustee and the majority voting member, she replied. I can stop an unauthorized payment before someone manufactures a reason for it. My phone started vibrating almost immediately. My mother called once, twice, then 6 times in a row. Vivian explained that the account access had already been frozen, and company counsel had instructed everyone involved to preserve every record. 3 minutes later, my father called. A text appeared underneath it. Answer me now. Vivian told me I could answer, as long as I put the call on speaker and announced she was present. I accepted. What did you do? My father shouted. I reported an unauthorized company payment to the trustee. You called Vivian? His anger cracked into something closer to alarm. My mother's voice rose behind him. Maya, this is a family matter. You had no right to involve the business. The business paid my landlord, I said. You involved it first. My father accused me of calling them thieves, over $1,000. Vivian interrupted, calm and even. No one has accused anyone of theft. I'm reviewing an expense labeled as a consulting retainer. Provide the contract, the invoice, the business purpose, and the approval by 5 o'clock. He claimed they were only trying to teach me responsibility. Then you used the wrong account, the wrong description, and the wrong method, Vivian said. Do not contact the landlord again. Do not pressure Maya to surrender her lease. My mother said I had become dependent and needed an intervention. For the first time in my life, someone separated that accusation from the actual issue at hand. Her employment status has nothing to do with whether company funds were misrepresented, Vivian said flatly. My father threatened an emergency board meeting. Vivian welcomed the request after he produced the records. Then she ended the call. The apartment looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier, but the balance of power inside it had completely changed. My parents had always defined every disagreement in our family. If I protested, I was emotional. If I asked questions, I was disrespectful. If I ever involved anyone else, I was betraying the family. Their real advantage had never been wisdom. It had always been isolation. Sam arrived with groceries, phone chargers, and a legal pad. Instead of telling me what to do, he asked what I needed. Together, we built a timeline. I'd been laid off at 9:12 that morning. I'd called my parents at 9:47. Frank had contacted me at 10:18. That meant my parents had reached him almost immediately. They hadn't spent hours worrying about me. They had moved directly from hearing bad news straight into executing a punishment. That afternoon, a tenant attorney named Alicia Reyes called me. She explained that a landlord generally couldn't erase a fixed-term lease without legal or contractual grounds, and that accepting money from outsiders to remove a lawful tenant could create serious liability for him. She told me to communicate only in writing from that point on, and reached out to Frank herself to confirm whether he intended to honor my lease. Within an hour, Frank emailed that his earlier demand had been premature and that no eviction action would proceed. It wasn't an apology. It was fear dressed up in professional language. Alicia warned me that stopping the eviction was only the first battle. My parents might call the transfer a misunderstanding. Frank might minimize his own role. Natalie might deny knowing anything at all. Evidence, she said, mattered far more than anger. Then Vivian requested a full independent audit. She had already confirmed that the consulting retainer had no contract, no invoice, and no board approval. When she started digging through older records, she found personal trips described as site visits, family dinners labeled as tenant outreach, and expenses connected to Natalie hidden inside marketing accounts. I remembered seeing similar entries during my summer working in the office years earlier. My father had told me, back then, that bookkeeping was too complicated for me to understand. That evening, Vivian sent me one sentence. The numbers have not matched the story for a long time. My parents had tried to purchase my eviction for $1,000. Before sunset the very same day, that payment had triggered a full review of years of company spending. The next morning, my parents began rewriting history. My mother emailed Vivian claiming the money was a temporary relocation incentive meant to protect me from future rent increases. My father produced a one-page consulting agreement describing Frank as an advisor on tenant resilience. The signature line was blank, and the file metadata showed it had been created only after Vivian demanded proof. They had manufactured an explanation after getting caught. My father called from a different number. "You're destroying the company your grandmother built," he said. "No," I said. "You used it to punish me." He warned that Vivian was using me to seize control of the business. For one brief moment, doubt crept in. My parents had spent years telling us every relative had hidden motives. Then I looked at the false label, the freshly manufactured document, and the original eviction message still sitting in my inbox. Facts didn't become less true simply because exposing them might shift who held power. He ended the call by saying, "You won't last a month without us." That sentence stayed with me, mostly because part of it might genuinely become true. I had limited savings, 2 weeks of severance, and no job. Winning the lease dispute alone wouldn't rebuild my life. I couldn't make revenge my only plan, and I couldn't let my parents remain the center of every decision I made going forward. Sam and I divided the crisis into 4 areas: housing, legal protection, employment, and money. Alicia secured written confirmation that my lease remained fully active. I cut expenses and calculated exactly how long I could cover rent on my own. Then I started contacting former colleagues and clients. Asking for help felt humiliating because my parents had spent my whole life training me to treat need as failure. Sam pushed back on that. "You aren't asking anyone to carry you," he said. "You're just letting them know you're available." My first interview afterward went badly. When the hiring manager asked how I handled conflict, I remembered my father yelling and completely lost my train of thought. The interview ended early. I walked outside convinced my parents had been right about me all along. Sam didn't offer empty praise. That one actually hurt more. He just said, "Learn what you can from it, and let the rest belong to today." While I searched for work, the audit uncovered a much wider pattern. Over several years, my parents had used company funds for personal travel, home improvements, Natalie's professional memberships, and private family events. Some expenses might have had a legitimate business element, but approvals were missing and descriptions were suspiciously vague. Money had also been moved from maintenance reserves into discretionary accounts without any proper authorization. Natalie called me after her company credit card stopped working. I hadn't even known she had won. She accused me of ruining her certification renewal. I asked whether she was actually an employee of the company. She claimed she helped with branding, but the auditor found no contract, no payroll record, and no documented project tied to her name. Then she revealed the rest of the plan, without meaning to. My parents hadn't admitted it, but they were going to let you stay at the lake house, once you apologized. The lake house belonged to the company. My parents had intended to force me out of my legal apartment, let me believe I had nowhere left to go, and then offer controlled housing only after I submitted to their rules. They wanted to manufacture the emergency and then present themselves as the rescue. Thank you, I said. For what? For explaining the plan. I documented every word of it. Alicia also demanded Frank's messages with my family. Facing his own legal exposure, he finally handed them over. My mother had written, "She will panic, but do not back down." My father wrote, "Once she is nowhere else, she will come home and listen." Natalie had reacted with a thumbs-up emoji and asked whether the lake house should stay unavailable until I apologized. For years, I had wondered whether their version of love was simply too difficult for me to understand. Those messages made the answer painfully clear. They might have genuinely felt something like love, but they used fear and access to make it entirely conditional. A feeling doesn't excuse a method. Vivian asked whether I wanted every message sent to the full board. My first instinct was to expose absolutely everything. Alicia asked me what I wanted most: protection, accountability, or humiliation. I admitted honestly that I wanted all three. Humiliation is the one you can't control, she said. Protection and accountability can be documented. I submitted only the evidence directly relevant to the company payment and my lease. I never posted anything online, and I never sent it through the wider family. That restraint would matter later. The emergency board meeting was set for Friday. The night before, my mother left a soft, careful voicemail saying families make mistakes. In the final sentence, she asked me to tell Vivian that the payment had actually been my idea. I saved the recording in 3 separate places. I joined the board meeting by video from Sam's apartment. On screen were Vivian, 2 independent directors, company counsel, the auditor, my parents, and Natalie. My father wore the expression he used whenever he wanted confidence to substitute for actual proof. My mother held a folder labeled Family Resolution. Vivian stated the purpose of the meeting plainly: unauthorized spending, a false expense description, and interference with a tenant's lease. She referred to me not as their daughter, but as the affected tenant. That single distinction cleared away the emotional fog instantly. My father described the $1,000 as compassionate assistance. He claimed Frank had simply misunderstood. My mother presented a proposed family support agreement, requiring me to move into the lake house, attend financial coaching with my father, submit job applications for their approval, and repay housing costs later. She offered it as proof of their good intentions. One director asked when the agreement had actually been created. My mother said after my layoff. The file metadata showed it was 3 weeks old. That was the twist even I hadn't expected. My parents had prepared terms for controlling my housing before I ever lost my job. They knew my company was considering restructuring because Natalie had heard confidential rumors through someone in recruiting. A recovered message from her read, "Maya's department may get cut. This could be our chance to force a reset." My mother had replied, "Start thinking about housing pressure. Your father will handle the landlord." The board went completely silent. My parents hadn't reacted badly to sudden, unexpected news. They had simply waited, patiently, for a vulnerable moment to arrive. My father turned toward Natalie and snapped, "Why did you keep that message?" In one sentence, he abandoned the daughter who had actually helped him. Natalie stared at him like she had just learned that favoritism was never loyalty. It was usefulness. Vivian asked for my statement. I said I wasn't asking the company to solve my unemployment or to punish anyone simply for being unkind. I was asking it to address a company account used to manufacture a private housing crisis, a false label used to hide the payment, and a plan that treated business assets as tools of family control. Then I played my mother's voicemail asking me to claim the payment had been my own idea. My father leaned back in his chair. My mother closed her eyes. The auditor presented preliminary findings: unsupported reimbursements, personal expenses, and money removed from maintenance reserves without required approval. One transfer, specifically, had delayed roof repairs after tenants reported active leaks. Their entitlement, it turned out, had already affected far more people than just me. During a short recess, my father texted, "Stop this now, and we can still be a family." I replied, "Family was never supposed to require my silence." When the meeting resumed, the board suspended my parents' management and financial authority pending completion of the audit. Natalie's access ended immediately. An outside manager was appointed to protect tenants, accounts, and records. The board also authorized efforts to recover unsupported personal expenses. My father shouted that Vivian had staged a coup. My mother began crying, but her very first question was, "What are we supposed to tell people?" Even in that moment, reputation still mattered to her more than repair. The meeting ended without a final repayment number, but their immediate control was already gone. They could no longer move money, pressure employees, or use company properties as rewards for obedience. 2 hours later, Frank asked to settle. His first proposal offered a written confirmation of my lease and reimbursement for some of my legal costs. Alicia rejected it outright. She required a formal statement that I had never defaulted on anything, payment of my documented expenses, a rent credit, a renewal option with a capped increase, and mandatory landlord-tenant law training from an independent provider. He agreed after several days. The man who had tried to convert my home into a transaction now had to sign terms designed specifically to protect my tenancy. That same afternoon, the marketing firm for my earlier failed interview officially rejected me. For a moment, the old story rushed right back in: unemployed, unstable, unable to survive without my parents. Then a former client named Elena Cruz emailed me. I had reached out to her earlier that week. She needed a contract strategist for 3 months and asked whether I could start Monday. The pay was slightly below my old salary and the position was temporary. It wasn't a magical rescue. It was work I had actually earned through a professional relationship built long before any of this crisis began. I accepted. Sam and I celebrated with takeout on my apartment floor, surrounded by boxes I no longer had to pack. Natalie messaged me, "Dad says this is your fault. Mom won't stop crying. Vivian ruined everything. Are you proud?" I typed several angry answers, deleted every one of them, and finally wrote back, "I'm proud that I stopped cooperating with something wrong." She never responded. Over the following month, the audit became harder and harder for my parents to dismiss. Company records revealed personal travel, renovations, private events, and expenses tied to Natalie hidden behind vague business labels. The board's lawyers began calculating a full repayment figure. Industry invitations were quietly withdrawn, since my parents no longer represented the company in any official capacity. The image they had protected so fiercely for years began collapsing under records they had created themselves. My mother called from an unknown number and said, "You took my reputation. You built it on a story that wasn't even true." "We never would have let you become homeless," I replied. "You needed me to believe that we would." She had no answer for that. That silence gave me the clearest definition of their entire plan. They had wanted fear, not actual failure. They had intended to hold the rescue over my head until I finally surrendered. The complete audit arrived 6 weeks later. It identified more than $200,000 in unsupported or improperly approved personal expenses across 8 years. Not every item was recoverable, and some could still be reclassified if valid records eventually surfaced, but the overall pattern was undeniable. The board permanently removed my parents from management, canceled the salaries and benefits tied to their positions, and demanded substantial repayment. They retained minority ownership, but lost the expense accounts, vehicles, and authority that had once supported their public image. An outside manager restored funds to the maintenance reserves and opened a formal complaint process for tenants. Problems my father had dismissed for years were finally addressed. The company slowly started behaving like the ethical business my parents had always advertised it to be, but never actually ran. Alicia proposed a separate resolution for my individual case. My parents would reimburse the costs Frank hadn't already covered, sign a non-interference agreement, stop contacting my employers and landlords entirely, and formally acknowledge that I had never requested the payment. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue further civil claims, unless they violated the terms. My father initially refused, believing that signing would make him look guilty. Then the board's repayment demand put real pressure on their personal finances. To meet part of it, they sold the lake house, the very property they had once planned to offer me only after I apologized. The symbol of their control ended up funding part of the repair it had caused. They signed the agreement 2 days before Alicia was set to file suit. The agreement barred them from interfering with my housing or employment, making any transactions in my name, or publicly claiming that I had requested the eviction myself. It also contained a written acknowledgement that they had initiated the payment specifically to pressure me into leaving my apartment. It wasn't an apology, but it was the truth, finally, in a form they could no longer rewrite. Natalie faced consequences of her own. Her recruiting firm reviewed exactly how she'd obtained and shared the restructuring rumor. She was placed on leave and later resigned. She called me furious. "You destroyed my career," she said. "You passed along confidential information so they could plan how to corner me." "I didn't think they would actually do it," she added quietly. "You reacted to the plan with a thumbs up," I reminded her. She went silent, then finally admitted, "They always said you thought you were better than us." I wanted them to see that I was loyal. For the first time, I understood her role without excusing it. My parents rewarded her whenever she served their narrative and blamed her the moment her own messages became evidence against them. Favoritism had made her feel safe, but only for as long as she remained useful. "I hope you learn who you are when loyalty isn't the same thing as obedience," I told her. "I can't do that work for you." I blocked her for 30 days. My father sent letters about sacrifice and gratitude. None of them ever included the words, "I was wrong." He told relatives that I had manipulated Vivian to gain control of the company. That rumor collapsed the moment Vivian issued a formal statement confirming I would receive no ownership, payment, or job from the results of the audit. I had never asked for any. My father simply couldn't imagine action without personal gain attached to it, so he invented one for me. My mother's final message before the agreement took effect read, "We did what we thought was best." I replied, "Believing something is best doesn't remove your responsibility for what it actually did." Then I stopped responding entirely. My contract job was demanding. During the first month, stress caused me to miss a minor deadline. I braced myself for humiliation. Instead, my manager simply asked for a recovery plan. I gave her one, corrected the problem, and moved forward. That single experience taught me more about real responsibility than any of my father's speeches ever had. Accountability requires truth, repair, and changed behavior, not a manufactured disaster dressed up as a lesson. At the end of 3 months, Elena offered me a permanent role leading client strategy. The salary matched my old job, and the terms were even better. I negotiated before accepting. That detail mattered to me. I wasn't grabbing the first rescue offered out of fear. I was reviewing, asking questions, and choosing deliberately. The night I signed, I stood beside my apartment door for a long moment. Months earlier, my parents had treated that door as a lever they could pull whenever they wanted. Now it was simply mine, to open or close as I chose. I still didn't feel triumphant every single day. Some mornings I missed the family I once believed I had. Some nights I replayed the calls and wondered whether I could have handled everything more privately. Then I reminded myself that privacy was exactly what had protected them all those years. They had counted on my shame more than they had ever counted on Frank's cooperation. Their punishment hadn't made me stronger. Stopping it had. 6 months after the layoff, Vivian invited me to the company's annual meeting. I declined the formal appearance, but met her for coffee afterward. She told me repairs were underway, financial controls had been completely rewritten, and tenants could now report problems without ever going through my parents. The company had recovered enough money to restore its reserves. My parents remained owners on paper, but had no operational authority left. Their repayment plan would continue for years to come. "Do you regret calling me?" Vivian asked. I considered the real cost. My relationship with my parents had become a legal boundary. Natalie and I had barely spoken. Extended relatives had chosen sides. There was no version of justice that would ever restore the family I once believed existed. "No," I said. "I regret that calling you was necessary." She nodded. That's usually how accountability feels. I asked why she'd given me her number all those years ago. She said her own grandmother once warned her that family businesses fail when relatives confuse access with ownership and affection with permission. Vivian had suspected blurred lines in our family for years, but explanations always seemed to arrive before any real proof. The payment to Frank was different. A false label, a private purpose, a cooperative witness, and a direct victim willing to actually speak up. "You didn't ruin them," she told me. "You interrupted them." My parents didn't become homeless, and they didn't disappear. Their consequences were serious, not theatrical. They moved from their large house into a smaller townhouse. My father took on consulting work that required real invoices and outside approval. My mother stopped speaking at industry events. Natalie eventually found work outside of recruiting after completing a mandatory ethics course. Their lives continued, just without the authority and image that had once protected them from ever being questioned. 3 months after signing the agreement, my mother emailed and asked to meet. She had followed the rules and hadn't pressured me once, so I agreed to 30 minutes at a public cafe. At first, she talked about the embarrassment, the audit, the house. I waited. Finally, she said, "I was wrong to call Frank." It was the first direct acceptance of responsibility I had ever heard from her. She admitted the family support agreement had been prepared before my layoff. She admitted they had planned to make me believe I had nowhere else to go, and then offer the lake house only if I accepted their conditions. "Why?" I asked. "Because you were making choices without us," she said. "Your father thought you were drifting too far away." There it was. They hadn't feared my failure. They had feared my independence. I told her I wasn't ready for a normal relationship with them and might never be. An apology without consistent, sustained change wouldn't reopen my life to them. She cried, but she didn't argue. When our time was up, she asked permission to email me again in a month. I said yes. My father took a different path entirely. He mailed me a copy of the signed agreement with a single note attached. "You won." I returned it with a note of my own. "This was never a contest. I wanted you to stop." He never contacted me again. Some people expected me to publish every message, take over the company myself, or celebrate each of their losses publicly. I did none of those things. I kept my apartment. I recovered my costs. I secured my work. I protected my name. And I forced the people who had used money as a weapon to repay what they had misused. Their authority ended. Their actions became records they could no longer rewrite. That was enough. On the first anniversary of my layoff, I renewed my lease. I read every clause, asked Alicia exactly one question, and signed. Then I hung the keys on the brass hook beside my door. A year earlier, I had thought losing my job meant losing the only proof I had that I was capable. My parents tried to turn that fear into obedience. Their plan ended up showing me exactly where my real power had been hiding all along. In documents, in boundaries, in witnesses, and in the willingness to seek help before panic could turn into surrender. Sam remained my friend, not my savior. We disagreed plenty. He told me when I was becoming consumed by the audit, and I told him when his advice sounded too simple. He never replaced my family. He simply helped me recognize what a relationship looks like when support doesn't require submission. Elena later promoted me to train younger strategists on her team. The lesson I found myself repeating most often was simple. Mistakes are information, not identity. People grow through truth, tools, and room to repair, not when someone manufactures a crisis and calls it love. Natalie eventually emailed me. "I helped them corner you because being useful to them made me feel safe. I'm sorry." I waited 2 weeks before replying. I thanked her for being honest and agreed to occasional emails. Nothing more. It wasn't reconciliation. It was one unlocked window in a house whose doors mostly remained closed. My mother kept writing every month. I ignored the defensive messages and acknowledged the accountable ones. Slowly, she learned that access was never guaranteed by a title. It had to be built through consistency. My father chose silence, and eventually I stopped interpreting that silence as another punishment. From someone who had spent his whole life using words to control me, it started to feel like peace. The $1,000 was never really about rent. It was the price my parents paid to purchase fear. They believed that fear would bring me home. Instead, it triggered a full audit, exposed years of misconduct, ended their control of the company, forced a major repayment, cost them the lake house, damaged the reputation they valued more than almost anything, and placed permanent limits around their access to my life. They always said I had to fall before I could change. They were right about exactly one thing. I did change. I stopped confusing cruelty with discipline. I stopped treating secrecy as loyalty. I stopped waiting for the people who hurt me to agree that I had actually been hurt. Most importantly, I learned that protecting yourself is never revenge, simply because the people who lose power over you decide to call it betrayal. The morning I lost my job, I thought my entire life had been reduced to one terrible phone call. By noon, I made another one. That call didn't save me by magic. It simply gave the truth somewhere to go. Everything that came after, organizing evidence, facing the board, rebuilding my income, and enforcing my boundaries, was work I still had to do myself. So when my father screamed, "What did you do?" the real answer wasn't only that I had called Vivian. I had stopped asking permission to defend my own life. And once I did that, their $1,000 lesson became the single most expensive mistake they ever made.